It is the afternoon. Just wanted to let you guys know that we have a sign-up sheet in the back. If you guys are interested in getting our emails. If you're here for a tour guide continuing education, we have another sign-up sheet for that to verify that. We also have snacks and water in the back, so please take that so Kara doesn't have to bring it back with her. So we appreciate that. And we'd like to thank Jeff Shepard for coming here today to talk to us about Indigenous peoples around the Charleston area. You're really excited at the Historical Commission to be able to highlight just everyone who's been a part of our history, even if they're sort of underrepresented historically. So Mr. Jeff Shepard, BA in Anthropology, University of Alabama, has conducted field work throughout the southeastern United States and has over 25 years of archaeological field and lab experience. Jeff currently serves as the laboratory director for Rockington and Associates. Oh, awesome. Thank you. Jeff currently serves as the laboratory director for Rockington and Associates. Sorry, y'all. We're working on it. Tech issues.
You're so bad. Testing. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Is this better? Okay. Danielle, you have a lovely voice.
All right, try this one more time. Thank you. Mr. Jeff Shepard, BA in Anthropology from the University of Alabama, has conducted field work throughout the southeastern United States and has over 25 years of archaeological field and laboratory experience. Jeff currently serves as the laboratory director for Rockington and Associates, a cultural resources consulting firm with offices in Charleston, Savannah, and Atlanta. His areas of specialty include the analysis of flaked stone debitage. I'm sure he'll explain what that means. No, that's okay. And tools, daub, and prehistoric architecture, and low country colonial indigenous interactions as expressed through native pottery traditions and colonialware. Along with his wife Jordan, their daughter Ellen, and their coonhound Lucy, Jeff values identifying as a Charlestonian and the privileges and resulting responsibilities that come along with living in such a special place. Thank you guys for coming, and please welcome Jeff.
Thanks everyone. This is my first time with a microphone, so bear with me. Too close, too far. Thanks so much everyone for the invitation to come out here, both the town of Mount Pleasant and the Charleston County Library for hosting me. I should start out with, as a child, libraries were a space for me to explore and find adventure in. Wandering through the stacks of this library that I could ride my bike to. As a my daughter's age is 13, sometime around then was really a special place. So whenever I can come and support libraries, it's a main goal of myself. So let me get started with it. Emphasizing the Indigenous experience and overview of low country native interactions through archaeology. It's a fancy way of saying what I do is, one of my primary jobs is to kind of look from an archaeological perspective on what it means to be indigenous. And that's a kind of a grandiose statement to say. So I want to introduce two terms to you that I'm going to be referring to throughout this talk today. What I'm going to speak about is emic and etic perspectives. So an emic perspective, in essential, is like what, if you were part of an indigenous tribe or something along those lines, you would have an innate enculturation because you were brought up through that community, much like as a Mount Pleasant person. You were brought up through Mount Pleasant and what that means, right? So that's the emic perspective. An etic perspective is what I am as an archaeologist. I am not native, I am not indigenous. I study these things for, as we're saying, for over 25 years now. But I don't have that ability to be as part of inside of that culture. So I have to look at it from an analytical perspective, right? That's why I do archaeology. That's why I work in the labs. I look at the material culture that was left behind, and I use those as tools and clues onto how to kind of reconstruct behaviors, right? Whereas if you come from an EMIC person and you're part of that group, you inherently know these things because that's a part of you. You're enculturated in that group. So we come from it from two different perspectives, but when we can unite those two, we can really present a much fuller picture of what it means to be from this perspective, from this low country, right? Whether you're European-based or indigenous-based. These are both important things about what defines the low country. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I speak kind of informally. So if people have questions, we'll need to keep things going because we have time restraints and all that, but like, I definitely want to have a conversation, not just me talking to y'all. That never works for me. So let's get going. So I want to start out with a little bit about quickly what archaeology is and what it is not, because I get this every single time. When I often do artifact ID days for community groups, museums, all that, and I would say probably 25% of the things I get are fossils. I have zero ideas of what happened millions and millions of years ago, right? So this idea of this giant brontosaurus, no clue. There were no humans around at that moment in time, and so I can't help you with that. So that is one thing that an archaeologist is not, right? The second thing, and probably what most of us know about, is Indiana. Now, I wish this was archaeology, right? Whips, you know, finding these fantastic things, these adventures and all of that. While there are adventures in archaeology, it's not quite to the extreme of Indiana Jones, right? But man, I would kill for that hat and the leather jacket, for sure. So, not that either. Let me show you what archaeology is. So, archaeology starts from everything from finding sites. You know, imagine this area. We're living in a neighborhood, right? That area has never been looked at from an archaeological perspective. There could be sites there could be villages there could be towns there that we have no idea about. So, a lot of what archaeology does is go out and identify these sites before they're lost, right? Other things that we do is document sites, and that comes through the artifacts that you see up in the right-hand corner, right? These artifacts are like what I was speaking about just a few minutes ago. These are the clues that we have to use in order to kind of reconstruct behavior through archaeology. And it happens all over. Sometimes it happens outside, up in Dorchester County. It happens in my lab here over in West Ashley. It happens in the basement of downtown Charleston, right? Archaeology occurs in all of these different spaces. It's not just out in the wilds of, wherever Indiana Jones is practicing archaeology. It's in oftentimes our backyards. So that comes to what Brockington is, and I always want to kind of talk a little bit about, not from an ad kind of perspective, but like what CRM is. And when I say CRM is cultural resource management. And so we're on the front lines of kind of like, with historic preservation, universities and all, archaeologists from an academic perspective, right? They have their own kind of research goals and things that they want to accomplish. Where CRM is, cultural resource managers, we're out there on the front lines making sure that as development occurs, the resources that are below ground or above ground aren't being ignored. So we don't often get the opportunity to kind of like pick where we want to go and dig. We're told to go out there and dig because this is where they're going to do such and such event kind of thing. So we kind of just go wherever we're needed to go. Luckily, Brockington has worked in the Low Country now for over 35 years. And we have long-term clients that allow us to keep coming back out over and over again and return to these sites and keep doing more and more investigations on it. So sometimes you'll see us like Bronwyn. She works in the lab now, but that's her on survey in the middle of a swamp and some, calf water up to her shins. Often that's what archaeology looks like. Or that's Eric Poplin here on this side. This is down on Elliott Street. That's Martha Zierden, if anyone knows her. She's a long-term archaeologist, unfortunately just retired from the Charleston Museum. We work with all sorts of people. So the other thing about archaeology is it's not always in the wilds and it's not in isolation. We work with all sorts of groups of people in order to kind of like help fulfill that story of what these people were doing before us. Oh, and I should mention, that man in the center, that's Paul Brockington. He passed away about 2 years ago. He was the founder of our company, And so I always want to point him out as someone, he was one of the leaders of CRM development in the southeastern kind of world back in the 70s when this was all kind of growing up. So Paul worked at SKIA in Colombia for years. He's dedicated, there's lots of other Brockingtons all around the Low Country, so we're very privileged to have a long-term connection here and then to continue to practice archaeology here. So, archaeology in a nutshell. Let me give you a little bit of perspective on who I am. When I started doing archaeology in the late 90s, I found myself at the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, not to upset anyone, but it was an amazing facility and university at that moment in time with a lot of great archaeologists that really kind of instilled this value in me about while we do archaeology, what we're actually doing is telling these stories of people that lived before us. And I'll never forget that moment. So, this is 2001. 2001, this is Moundville site, so that's this site right here. This is located about 10 miles south of Tuscaloosa, so kind of western central Alabama. It's one of the largest mound complexes found in the southeastern United States. There's almost 30 mounds there that are highly oriented, this is all a space that was designed with intent, right? And so this picture here was the summer of 2001, which is Mound V, which is this mound right here. This is where the chief mound was. Right behind it was this kind of space that had never been excavated at Moundville. I'm in that red shirt there, Dusty, as it's known as back then. And to the left of me was this girl I met, and she's my wife now, back there, Jordan. So we have a daughter, Ellen, now, all because of this. So why I always show this picture is because archaeology, I think, is a really special discipline, but it also really builds connections. And yeah, if it hadn't been for this summer, I probably wouldn't be here right now. So we really have to shout out to this. Anyway, Mound V was a large kind of public structure. So kind of like the building we're in right now. It was a place where the community came together, right? It was a earthen lodge, and I won't get into the specifics of that, but it's a powerful space when there's buildings that a community or a society builds in order to build community, right? And so that's where I've always come from. I come from an architectural background as far as archaeology. I want to see what buildings, are they residential? Are they public spaces? Are they ceremonial spaces? Or are they something uniquely to that one singular site, right? What is the specific use? So I'll come back to this because while I don't deal with pre-European realities as much as I did at Moundville, these things are omnipresent here in the Low Country, I think, as we all know. Another thing kind of about me, and I wanted to tie this in with it being Indigenous month, starting about 4 years ago, one of the main goals of or kind of a new trajectory of my career has been working with Indigenous communities directly. And this has been, I will tell you, this has been one of the singular most powerful moments because it's one thing is to see the material culture, all the things that we leave behind, right? But it's one thing to talk to these groups and show them what we have of theirs and hear their stories, right? And what that means, it provides this other level. Again, from an EMIT perspective, like I was saying earlier, they can tell us a whole other world about artifacts versus what I can tell them about these artifacts. Those stories are critically important. So it starts right here. Believe it or not, Brockington, the small little Low Country southeastern firm, we got this contract to go out to Hawaii, right? It was amazing. My wife might not agree, but I got to spend a number of months out in Hawaii working with the Native Hawaiian Waianae community, it kind of changed the trajectory of my career. I started wondering what it meant what does it mean to these groups, and how can that make me better as an archaeologist? So Uncle Glenn right here kind of set me in this new path, followed up quickly by the next year I was out in Oklahoma, working at the Museum of the Great Plains, This is Chief Gary from the Wichita tribe. This is their cultural kind of representative, Robin. And then just this summer, I had the honor to do it's called a Traditional Cultural Properties Survey. And basically what that is you're out there in these spaces and you're working directly with tribal nation partners, and they're out there surveying lands to see things that we couldn't actually find as archaeologists. We're not looking for artifacts. They're looking for, rocks that are oriented in a certain space, plant life that are a certain thing, geographic realities around you that we, as someone from an edit perspective, I can't see what they can see, right? So we were out in Colorado Springs surveying with 6 different tribal nations and a total of 12 different Indians that were there working with us in partnership. So why I'm really proud to be here today is because of this kind of thing. It's like working directly with Indigenous groups and hoping to provide a bigger picture of kind of what archaeology is. So that's me, that's archaeology. Let's talk about low country archaeology. Roughly about, 7-8 years ago, Brockman Associates, we excavated the Andrew Percival site. Does anyone know Andrew Percival? About Lord Ashley, right? Lord Ashley, he's one of the reasons why we're all here right now. Andrew Percival was related to Lord Ashley, and he came over here specifically to help the colonists develop the Indian trade. And when I say Indian trade, there's going to be a lot of different things that you're about to see. There's going to be artifacts, there's a material culture, but there's also people that were involved in the Indian trade. I want to be specific about that. Andrew Percival, so where we're kind of looking at Somerville area, is everyone familiar with Somerville? The ponds, that development up there is kind of just west of downtown Somerville. That's the area that we're working at. So the ponds is right here. This is Andrew Percival. Like I said, it's his early plantation. So it dates to the late 1670s, right after kind of contact. There's a big outflow from Charlestown Landing. People, again, why we set up a colony, why English set up a colony here in the South Carolina Low Country was for economic reasons, right? There wasn't many religious or other background reasons. It was purely economics. So as everyone was kind of like forced in there at CTL, right? People quickly wanted to expand out there and make their fortunes, right? And so the Ashley River becomes this kind of really focus for the 1670 to 1680 kind of span. And everyone, all the people that were there to make their fortune were moving out there quickly out into the hinterlands of that area. So if you're ever at Charlestown Landing, go into the museum, they have a really great exhibit where you can push the buttons and you can see the kind of development of early plantations. This is pre-African slavery too, we should talk about. This is, this quite hasn't happened yet. So, here's kind of a zoomed in area on top of his land. So this red line, that red line is what we call an area of effect, right, in CRM. And that means that area is going to get impacted by development or some sort of kind of impacts after the fact. And so we're in there to investigate these areas. Block 4, so we define these areas kind of like, well, we'll get into that in a minute, sorry. Block 4 was kind of where we're going to be talking about, so that's what I want to focus in on. Block 2 kind of refers to Andrew Percival's actual structure. That I'll show you here in a second. So, what do we do when we do archaeology? The first thing that we do is we go out and we shovel test. So when I say shovel test, that's a 30-centimeter hole, about yay big, and we dig that straight down to subsoil. Subsoil in the low country is very clear. So golden hour, we all know what golden hour is, right? That's what subsoil looks like here in the low country. It's this beautiful golden sand. And as soon as you hit it, you know that it predates any human occupation in the low country area, right? So that's what all these holes, so that's anywhere from 60 centimeters to a meter down, right? So a meter is just over 3 feet deep, so that's how many holes, and we dug 738 shovel tests across this site, right? Of those, 478 were positive. that information, we then generate density maps. So all of these locations of positive shovel tests, they show us these areas of spaces that have like intense occupations or behaviors that are going on there, correct, right? So like I was showing you block 2, you can see up on the top, north part of it, lots of stuff going on over there. And then block 4, while it doesn't look as impressive, there's these very isolated, highly focused clusters of artifacts that we wanted to investigate. So, you guys, usually I use this slide at archaeology conferences because everyone knows this guy. This guy's name's O.D., John O'Donnell. He's our longest term employee at Rockington. We've been in existence almost 40 years. He's worked with us 38 years. So O.D. is about, I'm 5'10", O.D. towers over me. So he's like 6'3", 6'4". So you can see how deep down he is in this hole, right? You can't really see it in this picture, but what he's standing on is a prepared brick floor. This is the basement of Andrew Percival's house that was constructed in somewhere post 670 up there in Dorchester County. I mean, it was remarkable. It was full of olive green bottle glass, like bottles. The other thing that was very odd that we found in there were like artifacts that were predated anyone that was around, like very early steatite golds, really early kind of pre-contact artifacts there as well. But then the whole kind of host of all the expected early European goods that I'll get into. Yeah, this is a fortified structure up there. I mean, you've got to imagine this isn't Dorchester County like we know, right? This is out there on the frontier of Charleston. We all think about the harbor, you know, and that kind of like European frontier. What's happening out there in Dorchester County is really remarkable and what it means to be on this western frontier hinterlands kind of edge of Charleston. It's really a unique space. So, that was Andrew Percival's house. In that other section, block 4, this is where things get really, really interesting from an indigenous perspective. So you'll see the word feature. Features refer to, in archaeological terms, they refer to a soil anomaly, right? A change in soil colors or soil textures. So you can see kind of like the outer soils here are kind of this grayish color, right? Inside of these features, they're dark black or dark browns and all that. And that's because of all the organic materials that are inside of these features, right? That are being kind of, they're breaking down over time. And so you get that, you get a distinct soil change. Like if you ever, has anyone like dug a post hole in their backyard, right? One day, we will be able to go back and see that. Once you dig a hole in the ground, it's there. And you can see it over and over again. It was one of the most, as a young 20-something-year-old archaeologist, like, wow, you can still see something that was dug 2,000 years ago. That, to me, is still a remarkable thing. So, anyway, so in Block 4, which is this indigenous space that we found around Andrew Percival's house, again, Andrew Percival was when he was starting the Indian trade, correct? So we found these kind of oval-shaped features, these long oval-shaped features. I mean, these things are, you know, as long as one of these rows, basically, of chairs. Inside, so once we found those, we started excavating down to see what's inside of them, right? So those are very dramatically different than what we see indigenous spaces just about 100 years before European contact. So Daniel Island, right? Kind of where, geez, it's off the main road there. We dug a site back in, I don't know, the late 90s. And so you'll see here, instead of like these large features, like these large ovoid features, do you see all these little circles? Those are posts, those are single set posts, right? This is a house. You see how that circular wall that goes on? This is what a house looked like, an indigenous house looked like before European contact right here in Charleston, South Carolina, right? Just on Daniel Island. Inside of it, you'll see these bigger stains. See those dark stains? I said that's all that organic material. These are refuse pits, like where they're throwing away their trash and things like that. That's why you get these different soil changes, because you've thrown away, you know, like we do, right? Our scraps of vegetables, our scraps of meats and all that stuff. And that goes into these holes, and as that breaks down, it enriches the soil all around it, and that's why we can see it, right? But not only that, so like these are wooden posts, right? And so as that tree breaks down, you can see that it leaves that stain behind. And so that's how archaeologists are able to recognize structures, all sorts of kind of different behaviors across that site. So I just want to kind of juxtapose to like what it looked like just before European contact, really big, houses, formalized houses versus those pits that we found at the Percival site. So, inside of those pits at Andrew Percival's site, we found this. This top table shows the initial inventory of items that came over on the Carolina, which was the first ship that came over and docked there at Charlestown Landing. On board of it, so specifically, are the glass beads, 240 pounds of glass beads, which are these tiny, like H and I, these are these tiny little glass beads. Does anyone know where the glass beads came from? So, these glass beads came from all the way from Italy. The island of Verona, right? Verona glass that we've all heard about, that was why it's such a specialized island outside of all the glass, because this was what made Venice rich, right? It was the glass. They had the secret, they knew how to do it there. So, yeah, they were a major exporter of glass beads, trade beads. And so this is what Europeans were using to make initial interactions with indigenous groups. Not only glass beads, but hatchets, iron hatchets. Imagine, you're still using stone tools. You're having to cut down trees. Remember the single set posts that I showed you? You had to cut down those trees with a stone hatchet. Imagine what an iron hatchet would like. It would be game-changing in some ways, right? So these were big things. Hoes, obviously agriculture, hollowing adze, so that's for stripping bark off of trees, knives, oft-white hafts, which I love, which are like tool handles, and then scissors. I volunteer at Charlestown Landing and doing the Great Guns program, and so we always speak of the scissors that were traded into the. And then my favorite is the striped suits, which refers to fabric. They brought over fabric to trade with natives. So that was a big thing, which we don't think about because archaeologically fabric isn't really recognizable. It degrades before we can see it. So inside of those features that I showed you, those oval features at Percival's site, we find, so this is the original, here's what they're trading. So what we found over here was up on the top row, that's Delft ceramics. That came from Dutch, Dutch area. English also made it a little bit, so tin glaze, manganese mottled, olive green bottle glass. All of these are European trade goods that were brought in that mimic exactly what the Carolina was carrying over. Wrought nails, pipes, gun flints, small shot, all of that was being brought over and traded at Andrew Percival's at that site, at DR 87. So Europeans are giving these kinds of items to the indigenous people. What do you think are coming from the indigenous people? Any ideas? Food, deer skins. Absolutely, food and deer skins are true things, but they're also bringing humans. They're also trading other indigenous peoples. Again, this is African, before Africans are being brought over to the country for the most part. Excavating down into one of these features, we found whole vessels inside of these things, which when you find, so generally what we find are like, you saw in that previous picture, little bits and pieces of that stuff, right? When you find whole pots like this, you're into something very, very, very different, right? It hasn't been impacted by plowing. Most of Dorchester County, Westvaco, right? They've been planting trees up there for decades over there, right? So to find a space that hadn't been really monkeyed with spoke to something very different going on in there. So what we know, so here's two different pictures. We'll start over here. These are other examples so that you saw that whole pot coming out of that pit, right? So these are other examples of similar kind of pottery that we found at that site, which is, while it's similar to what we normally see, it's very different in other perspectives. What's that pile of carbonized stuff? Any idea? Charcoal. So it was one day so our office is over off of Long Point Boulevard, just down the street kind of. One day I was out there taking a break and I was wandering around. We're just like in an office park. And I was wandering around and they had just done a refreshing of all the landscape materials and everything. And I looked around and I was like, and this was on my lab table that morning. And I literally looked down and I was like, and I saw it. It was bark, like pine bark, right? This is all carbonized pine bark. While it doesn't seem that it's that exciting, there's an account. So Andrew Percival, again, he was the head of doing the Indian trade, right? His person on the ground, his name was Henry Woodward. You probably maybe have heard this name before. Henry Woodward talks about going to the Westos. Has anyone ever heard of the Westos? Are a group that settled. They came from Pennsylvania. They were actually kicked out of that area during the early 1600s, late 1500s, during the Beaver Wars up there, when the French, all that heavy fur trading that's going on there. They're kicked out of that area and they're moved down into the falls there in Virginia. They settled there for a little while, and what they're doing is they're heavily involved in slaving southeastern native groups, and they're trading them up into Jamestown and all those colonies. They start getting pressure. They move down into South Carolina. They actually settle on the outside of Augusta, modern-day Augusta, on the Savannah River. Andrew Percival and Henry Woodward make direct connections with the Westos and they become the English's major trading partners early on. So Henry Woodward travels from Charleston, South Carolina, in early 1670s, over to Augusta, Georgia, on these trails that were led by the Westos. They have to spend the night, and so he's talking about them building structures to sleep under. And it's basically like a lean-to, and he talks about pulling bark off of the trees and laying that over on top of these lean-tos, right? And so, and they talk about digging these little holes, like these little pits to sleep into. And I was like, well, that's what we're seeing out there at Andrew Percival's house. These are Westo structures that are here very temporarily, not like Daniel Island, right? These are houses. These are temporary structures where they're coming into Andrew Percival's house, doing specific trading opportunities there for, maybe a couple days, and then leaving and going back to Augusta, and then to get more people to bring over here to trade with Andrew Percival. So it's pretty remarkable. These kind of like mundane substances like pine bark that are just like out in our front yards. It's remarkable when you kind of just like take a step back, relax your eyes, relax your thoughts, and you start thinking about these objects as being from an Eamon perspective, right? What that means to that kind of cultural group. And when I heard the story of them pulling bark off of a tree, I was like, oh, I think we're on to something here. So this is one of the more remarkable artifacts I have laid eyes on. We excavated this out of another one of those features there at Andrew Percival's. It was at feature 637. So I want to show you a couple things about pottery. So the first thing is this big jar, right? This is a pretty large jar, about yay big. On the outside, does anyone have any idea how they made that decoration? Cloth. It's actually a carved wooden paddle, right? They had these wooden stamps that they would make, and they would carve them, and so you would get these very different stamping patterns. And so from an archaeological, again, from an edit perspective, we use these kinds of change in decorations as to look at from a chronological perspective, right? The change in time. It's like, I always talk about it in modern terms of like fashion, right? Oh, the newest Paris fashion show, and all of these things are being, humans innately want to change. And that's why archaeologists are able to do what we do, is because we can recognize that change and then hopefully document that in spans of time. So it's a carved wooden paddle, typically what we see in North American indigenous groups are large, kind of square paddles, right? That they would stamp the thing, and we can tell because we can often see the stamp edges and things like that. What I want to show you on this, I'm not tall, but so you can see this line right here, and then this line right here. These are very linear stampings, right? There was a very different paddle. We're friends, right? I can talk more, kind of more broadly. From my perspective, it looks like European cloth to me. It looks like the herringbone pattern of like European cloth, the outer jacket. Again, I work at CTL, or volunteer at CTL, and so I have to don these, not costumes, what are they called? Kits, sorry, not costumes. And I will look down there as I'm waiting there with the worm standing there, and I noticed that this herringbone pattern looked very similar to what I was seeing on the pottery at the time, right? And so if you have this indigenous group that's working solely with the English, they're going to make outward signs that they're here to work with the English, right? They're going to observe, just like we do. They're going to observe things about the colonists and like absorb them into their kind of quote-unquote culture, right? And then show them that, hey, we're working together. And I think that this is kind of one of these, we've never seen this kind of pattern before on pottery. I haven't found it on any other. Rockington's been excavating sites, like I said, for almost 40 years here. We've never seen this kind of pottery decoration other than what was going on there at Andrew Percival's site. So I really think that what we're seeing here is kind of this early connections between the colonists and the indigenous people that are living here. And when I say indigenous, I'm not one to like ascribe or what group is living here and there. That is one of the hardest things to actually talk about, like the Westos, where they are, where these different groups are. We see them on maps, where they're actually living. It's much more widespread, particularly at the time of contact, right? Because there's so much change that happens really quickly. So that's the kind of the first site that I want to talk about is Percival, right? So we've got early trade goods, knives, beads, early pottery that we haven't seen here before, very temporary structures here. So this is right at the mid-1670s into the 1680s. Percival dies and goes back to kind of late 1680s. He died, Percival ends up dying. So this is a very brief kind of perspective that we have. So early, right outside of Charlestown Landing is what this site kind of represents up on Dorchester County. The next site I want to talk about is 38 DR 480. So when I say 38 DR 480, that sounds all like whatever, right? So it's in, archaeologists name sites this way. So the Smithsonian Institute back in the 1800s kind of developed this system, right? So 38, that refers to, if Alabama is number 1, right? 38 is South Carolina. It's the states alphabetically, right? So 38 is going to be 1 through 50 in that first number. DR is going to be a state level code for that county. So Dorchester County is DR. CH is Charleston County. BK is Berkeley County, right? And then that number 480, that's the 480th site identified in Dorchester County. So this is kind of this trinomial, as we talk about it. But that's how archaeologists refer to sites. So you'll hear me say 38 DR 480 or something like that. And that's specifically to this one location. So again, we're up in Laurel Hill is the name of the plantation, again, outside of Somerville. 19th century, so really I can be even more specific. We're talking, this site was occupied by the group, this indigenous group, between 1820 and 1830, we think. Like a 10-year span at a site. We originally, again, so like I showed you in that other picture, remember all those holes, all those black dots all across the site, did the same thing out here. Started excavating shovel tests all across this. During the shovel test endeavor, we recognized where, so Laurel Hill Plantation enslaved buildings, that yellow oval. When I say enslaved buildings, that's just kind of like what you think of as an African enslaved row, those that were all along going into the main house. Next to it in that blue circle or oval, that's the barn in it. So all of that area, this is a neighborhood, or is going to be a neighborhood. All of that area in the blue and yellow, that was left is going to be preserved as is, right? Wooded, green space, not going to be impacted. But we started finding, so you'll see this the black area, that's where we were shovel testing across that area. And we saw that they were still going to build houses there, and so we had to go in there and do further investigations, right? So, like I said, this is that lower one, the outside of the preservation area, so outside of the blue and yellow. This is in that black kind of outlined area. We did additional shovel testing. This is odd. What are these? These are 5-meter intervals, so 5, 1, 2, 3, that far apart from one another, right? Really close shovel test intervals across there. So every black one is a positive shovel test. Every white one is a negative shovel test. Pink are test units, or kind of like, so going back to Indiana Jones, right? You've all seen the square holes that archaeologists dig. When I say a test unit, that's what you're seeing there in those pink areas, right? And then stars are metal detectors. So we often use metal detectors to find nails, all sorts of things like that, because if we can find a cloud of nails, so to speak, we know that there was probably a structure there at one point. So within that area, based on all the shovel test data, all the metal detecting, all the test units, we were to find 3 different spaces in there that we felt pretty confident there were structures there. We didn't know what kind of structures or anything like that, but we were pretty confident that they were there. Which was odd, because that map that I initially showed you with the barn and the slave row and the main house and all that, that was drawn by a surveyor at the time. And so it's odd that he didn't notice these structures that were clearly out there at the same time. We often wonder if they were just thought of as like ephemeral kind of structures that the surveyor person just thought were just outbuildings or kind of sheds or things like that that weren't really permanent property, right? Okay, so inside of those structure areas in the previous map, we have structure 1 and structure 2. What you'll see here are these paired features, right? This larger feature, larger circular feature here, which you can actually see one of our earlier test units. You see that rectangle that's inside of it? That's our test unit that we dug down based on the density of artifacts that we found during shovel testing. We dug a test unit in there, and it was like overloaded with materials. And so that's when we came back in there and we stripped off, like we'll have a backhoe. We'll bring in a backhoe in there, and it'll strip off all the topsoil and plows them, right? And underneath that, as I was saying, right, whenever you make a disturbance into the ground, there's going to be a soil change that's very obvious. And so again, here, like structure 1, large pit versus a small pit. It's odd. Wait, this is kind of odd. We just didn't know really what to make sense of it. So what we do is we started digging down into these things to investigate what they are. So you can see the areas that we stripped off with the backhoe, the scrapes that were in there. Then these are the large circular. So we start excavating those features down in arbitrary levels so that we can control. Like archaeology is all about controlling the excavation. So I use the word excavation and not dig. Digging is just what we do in our backyards and our gardens, or for a post hole or fencing and things like that. We try and excavate as best we can, right? It means we control digging. So our field folks are out there. Every time it rained, this entire thing would fill up with water, because it's clay. It's just Dorchester County, right? It's just clay out there. So they'd have to pump all this stuff out, let it dry out, and then get back in there and start digging holes again. So we have these structures out here that seem very, almost like what we saw up at 87, right? Very ephemeral, temporary kinds of structures, but clearly they're living here very different terms, right? Inside of them, what we found is, has anyone heard the term colonoware? Colonoware, right? So colonoware refers to kind of this, let me just be all archaeology here for a second. So it's a low fire earthenware. What it means is that it was fired, it was never fired in a kiln, it was fired on an open pit. It's natural occurring clays that they would add in different tempering things, and when I say tempering, that could be sand, limestone, shell. People add in all sorts of different things into clay in order to make pottery, right? So colonial ware is typically relates to African enslaved sites, right? We see colonial, it's ubiquitous here, and it's one of the things that defines South Carolina plantations is colonial ware. We don't really see colonial ware in Georgia. We see it in Virginia, but it's kind of different up there. It's not in North Carolina. It's really a South Carolina reality, right? And so we're like, hey, we're finding all of this colonial ware, 1820s, 1830s. Sure, we should be finding colonial ware there, right? There's going to be enslaved Africans in Dorchester County at this moment in time. But this was unlike any kind of colonial ware that we have seen before. It was very, very different. It's hard to see, but so like MNV 59 up there on the top left, see how red that is? That's an applied red film. They were, it's not we don't actually know how they did it. Like it could be like greases and things like that. They were mixing in with natural pigments. Painting that onto it and then firing it in a kiln or firing it in a fire. But they're red film. It's a very deliberate, intentional surface treatment that they're doing to it. And so you'll see lots of them are red films, right? There's lots and lots of red ones on here. You'll see things like MNV 57, that one's notched. That's a very indigenous rim treatment that we see. We don't ever see it on colonial ware, right? Red filming, we don't ever see it on colonial ware. Colonial ware, I should back up a little bit, it's very rarely decorated, right? If it's an enslaved African tradition, they wouldn't want decorations on. You know, the owners would not want decorations. You don't want people showing who they are in an enslaved reality, right? So colonial ware is indicatively not decorated. This was wildly decorated. Over 80% of the colonial ware or Little Fire earthenware out of this site was decorated. The other thing that's really interesting to show you is MNV 16 and 17. When I say MNV, minimum number of vessel, that's just an archaeology term. But those we know, and plus 18, 10, all these other ones up there on that top row, those are catawba pots. So has anyone heard of the catawba group, right, North Carolina? These were itinerant potters that were from North Carolina that would come down into Charleston regularly. And they were coming into Charleston. Does anyone have any ideas? This is one of the coolest things. Sealing wax, right? So the old letters where you see them seal it with they were coming into Charleston to buy sealing wax. Why? It's so they could decorate their pots with it. So you see that black line up at the very top of it? You can't see the actual decorate, like the paint is long gone. But it's sealing wax, so it's seeped into this pottery, right? Drayton Hall, if you ever go to Drayton, they have an amazing collection of it. There's all these decorations, oranges, yellows, reds, all these different colors, and it's all the sealing wax that they were buying in Charleston. So they would come here, sell their pots as they were coming to Charleston. All of the money they were made from that, they were buying sealing wax and other things, obviously, but like it's a really unique kind of, again, this indigenous experience. They were coming here for a very specific task and resource, right? But from an European kind of need, right? So we've got now kind of ephemeral structures out there at 480 or at Laurel Hill. Very odd colonial ware that shows not only just kind of, the African reality, but it also shows indigenous traits, and it shows other indigenous pots that they're buying, right? They're choosing to buy catawba pots. The other thing, so I showed you that stamp pot earlier. This is maybe the other most amazing pot I have ever seen in my life. This thing's it's only about yay big, right? It's real small. In it shows it has every kind of quality or attribute with all the ethnic groups that are making these kinds of things. This is really one of the most remarkable things. So let me break it down a little bit. On the top, so that's the outside of it, again, red filmed, right? These engraved cross lines, You maybe have heard with like on colonial typically a lot of times African kind of religious realities are marked with X's on the bottom of colonial wear, right? It's kind of, there's lots of conjecture about it, but this is a very, these engraved cross marks are very indicative of African spiritualized colonial wear. And then on the inside, it's hard to see, but kind of like right above that line, kind of right below the lip, this has an applied slip on the inside of it. So a slip is different than a film, not to get too crazy archaeology. A slip is a liquefied clay, basically, right, that they added a pigment to. And they put that on before it was fired. So you've got kinds of, and the foot ring. So the pronounced foot ring. Foot rings, so that's definitely not indigenous. They didn't make foot rings. That is a true European, they had never, no foot rings happened before European contact, right? This is a very specific, you know, they're making intentional choices in this pot, right? And potentially and showing all of the different ethnic markers of the people that were making these pots up there, right? So again, ephemeral structures, weird colonial wear that's made by a diverse group, potentially, of people, right? So that's not it. We're going to keep going here a little bit more. So also in these structures, we found pearl wear. Does everyone know what pearl wear is? So kind of the tradition of, like what we use nowadays is whiteware, right? It's mass-produced whiteware. Before that was pearl wear. So pearl wear kind of late 1700s into the mid 1800s is when you see pearl wear. It's very specific when you see it. That top right hand, that 415 number, that one is called China glaze. It's pearl wear. It's hand painted. It's painted that way to mimic Chinese porcelains because again, Europeans still aren't really making porcelains and they still want the Chinese stuff, but they're making other objects to mimic that, right? These are all different variations of pearl wares, right? And so we had 3 different structures out there at Laurel Hill, and we used, so again, all that weird colonial wear and these ephemeral structures, we needed something to kind of see what was going, were there any differences in these structures? And what it was, we started using the pearl wear because we had a large assemblage of pearl wear out there. And when we looked at it from an edit perspective, right, outside culture, analytic, I just looked at it just from frequency, relative frequencies, we could see different choices in each one of these structures. Each one of these structures was buying very specific decorated pearl wear. They weren't all buying the same thing. So if you saw the same pearl wear in every one of those houses, that would be very indicative of African enslaved realities because they were being, you know, items were being used, given to them, or not given to them, that's not the right word, but items were being, pottery and all these other things that they needed to use for daily life were being provisioned to them, right? So there's no choice. Every house has the same kind of thing. Here, we see houses making very specific choices. That means they're in the market. They're like interacting, they're making money, they're having choice, they have an agency, as we talk about it. Which pearl wear, by the way, pearl wear is my favorite thing in the world. It's just beautiful. It's like exaggeratedly decorated and lovely. Okay, last thing we found in these structures. Do you remember DR87, Venetian, Italian beads, all that? Well, man, we found a bunch of them up at Laurel Hill, right? 52 of the beads dates between 1670 and 1750, and only 4 of them date post that. We should talk, so kind of early on when beads start being brought in by European European groups, these were status markers for indigenous people, right? These became things, and we talk about them as being inalienable, right? They were buried with beads. Like these things, if you see beads, typically you're in a burial context and you need to, there's something going on here. So there's this reality of something that's like, I give the example of my wedding ring, right? To me, this is something I view as inalienable, right? It's part of me. I'll be buried with it. Now my wife over there views it differently because she sees it more as an heirloom object that like, oh, maybe my daughter owns, you know, maybe somewhere down in my family line they would want something like that, right? Heirloom versus inalienable kinds of objects, right? So these are non-burial contexts. We know that there's no burials out there at this site, 0 chance of it. So that means these things are out there in these houses. And what does that mean? To me, that means that there are these display objects. These things are passed down, heirloom objects that were given, probably now, you're talking 1670 to 1820, what, 2 generations? These things were handed down objects that were on display. Maybe there were tapestries on the wall, maybe there were clothing that they were worn, maybe there was something about them. These were never going to be buried with people. These have been translated into a whole different kind of category of objects, right? This is hugely powerful to me. I mean, massively powerful that we can see, you know, change happens. Whatever change happens, it happens. But when we can see the results of that, that's where it's powerful because it shows the agency of humans and what that means to make choices as a human. And that's innately what we do, right? So, yeah, weird structures, amazing pottery, and then now beads from the late 1600s. What is going on? Man, I spent, you don't even know, my wife knows my heartburn of that, right? So, man, I'm an archaeologist. I am not a historian. So this is when I turn it over to folks at Brockington that are the historians and let them do their work. So they dove into the census data. 1830 census. I want to point out a couple different things. So this blue line right here, this represents on this side enslaved Africans. Over here, what they called, at this moment in time, free colored persons. Okay? So the yellow lines are neighboring plantations on either side of Laurel Hill that we know people are there at, right? What's interesting is at Laurel Hill, which is in the green line, right? There are no people that are living there that are not either slaves, right? So it's an absentee plantation. A lot of people don't understand this too, is that a lot of plantations the owning class wasn't there, right? That's only, it's not Terra, right? It's not that kind of reality. So a lot of these kind of like, particularly on the frontier, were very like absentee, and you'd have an overseer or something like that over there on top of that. So, wow, we have at Laurel Hill kind of like this whole absence of that. And we were frustrated, it frustrates us as like why that wasn't there. And what made sense to us was because there weren't really necessarily slaves there. These were what we call settlement Indians. So settlement Indians were a group of well, you'll see the Natchez, Cusco, Edisto, right? They're a great example of what settlement Indians are, for the lack of a better term. It was because people native groups had different reactions to the early colonial onslaught, right? So Yamasee, right, they had their whole kind of, lack of a better term, confederacy that was going on down there, a group of different kind of, all these refugees that had grown together into become the Yamasee, right? There was a whole other group that people that were just, they chose to participate with the colonials, right? They were there on the, kind of in Dorchester, Berkeley County, all on the frontier. They could do things that colonists couldn't do, right? These are unsafe spaces for white Europeans to go out into the hinterlands all around where they're living, right? So things like collecting firewood, settlement Indians became the police force, basically, for early colonists for escaped slaves, right? There was a bounty, so if a native caught an escaped slave, they were given their guns, black powder, and any ammunition that was on them. That was their reward. So there was lots of incentive for them to work out there in these, like, kind of in that gray space, right? So it was finally the census data that kind of like led us into this reality of that you know, look, what's going on out there is you can see this translation, and it's marked by these glass beads, right? That whole translation of what it means to have something that's indigenous, and it's on your terms. It's you as a cultural group are defining it indigenously, emically, what that means, how you impart power into that category of object, versus from an edit perspective, that's what we're seeing here. That's how we were able to identify that kind of change in behavior, because from that emic to this outside perspective of seeing, like, using analytics to evaluate the leftover, you know, the cultural remains behind there, is what allows us to kind of like envision this different kind of this whole space and time from early colonial connections to as the census data is trying to erase what it means to be indigenous by using the term free colored persons, right? You see this, and this gets more into the history, which I'm not great at, but you'll see these change in terms in the census status. Earlier on, it's like Indian, or, you know, they'll have these terms. As it moves through time, by the time you get to the 1850s, it's just white and black, you know, and that's just not how, it's just not that simple in some ways. So, census data is powerful, it's just how you interpret that census data, right? So that kind of gives us this tour of the greater Charleston area. I just wanted to kind of like a quick thanks to everyone. So Brockington, we're a private firm. We're only doing this because there's developers and entities and permitting realities that want to preserve and document the history of the Lowcountry. And so Coulter Homes and True Homes, I really want to thank them because they have been long-term clients of us that have never shied away from their responsibilities of what it means to be a developer. They're building homes on top of homes, on top of homes, on top of homes. And that's, again, uniquely human. So development isn't lost. Development is just the next stage. After we're all gone, they'll be digging up, you know, the landfills of our demise, right? That kind of thing. And to see these changes. And then finally, the town of Mount Pleasant and the Charleston County Libraries for bearing with me for missing it last year, keeping with me, and I hope that I entertained you and informed you a little bit today. Thanks so much.